Okay, and so this is, so when I sometimes make this reference to theology, I'm not trying to go into land of hocus pocus. But what I'm saying is that there's a certain kind of, as it were, sort of goal, a certain image, a certain project that humanity is dedicated to, and the current animal embodiment is just a stage along the way. Because I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting if one thinks about the future of humanity from this standpoint is that there really are quite different futures being projected at the moment. That to varying degrees rely on our staying within our current physical limits. Okay? So you can imagine on the one hand, let's say the Peter Singer future of humanity, right? Where in a sense, we sort of go back to our animal roots in a sense. And in a sense, we sort of define ourselves and what counts as a meaningful life and what counts as moral relevance at a level that is commensurable with other animals that are roughly of our similar biological makeup, which is to say sentience. Okay, and so there we are very concerned about the pain threshold, the minimization of suffering, right? Those become kind of the morally relevant categories. We don't talk about self-transcendence, we don't talk about perfection, we don't talk about some kind of ideal state, right? We don't talk that way any longer, but rather we talk about a certain kind of ecologically sustainable existence in which creatures that are differently embodied as species, but nevertheless sharing a fundamentally similar carbon makeup, right, where there's like 95% genetic overlap or more, right, are able to coexist in an adequate fashion. And in a sense, the future of humanity lies in that kind of a world, right? One that in a sense does minimal changes to our bodies of biological birth, and in a sense kind of return perhaps to certain kind of default positions with regard to it. So there isn't this preoccupation with extending life indefinitely, for example. And indeed, if one is talking about thinking that there's value in having a diversity of life forms, then one might even want to think about in some way curtailing the human population in relation to the population of other species. And that's one way of thinking about the future of humanity, as a kind of reabsorption into nature in some sort of ecologically sustainable way, and that is a very strong idea, and it's a very, very much present with us. Then there's this other extreme idea that I just alluded to, where in a sense our biologies is just, in a way, just sort of a way station on the road to some sort of more durable way of realizing what it is that really matters to us as human beings, and usually that is understood in terms of some all-encompassing sense of intelligence in some way. And issues of intentionality and other mental properties get wrapped up into that. And this is obviously the Ray Kurzweil world. And the interesting thing about it is it creates maximum distance from our biological origins, and would just sort of, in a way, change the whole game, right? So from the standpoint of a lot of the kind of Darwinian arguments no longer seem so salient in a sense, because Darwinian arguments, in a way, have a lot of rhetorical purchase insofar as we see ourselves very much like other animals, right? But once you start thinking about our animal bodies as somehow negotiable or, disposable in some sense, then the Darwinian argument isn't quite so salient in terms of benchmarking where it is we should be going and how we should be thinking about ourselves. And also certain kinds of differences don't matter anymore. Like, for example, I think it's quite clear that if you move in the direction of the Kurzweil view of the future of humanity, the difference between humans and machines falls apart a bit. Okay, certainly we start to imagine ourselves as being embodied in what we would normally call machine forms. Okay, and so as it were, the difference between humans and technology merges. And so this is where the cyborg existence, of course, comes into being. And the idea being that the cyborg existence might just be a first step toward a more comprehensive cybernetic existence, where we become a kind of world machine. And that's what humanity is. And I think, some of Kurzweil's rhetoric sort of suggests are moving in that direction. So in this sense, the human, you might say, ends up in the long term being more closely identified with the mechanical than with the biological. Okay, and that the biological is an accident in a very, very profound way, and that really the mechanical is more what we're about. So there are those two extremes. And I actually think, especially if you think about the younger generation, there's constituency for both sides. And with regard to the second side, where the cyber side, the salience of that, I think there are a lot of, even though you might think that, well, the kinds of things that Kurzweil's talking about are never going to happen, or they're going to happen only in 2 or 3 centuries, or whatever, nevertheless, people are already in their biological bodies living their lives as if it were true, or on the horizon. And of course, all the time that people spend in front of a computer screen is a good example of that. Okay, insofar as the meaning of one's biological life is found primarily in terms of how one interacts, the second life phenomena, or just the sheer amount of time through which life is being transacted before a computer screen. And where one talks about having friends and all these sort of traditional social interactions that the paradigm cases of which are face-to-face are now being very easily transferred to computer-mediated ways of being. Okay? And this is not going away. This is becoming a larger and larger part of the way in which people live. One interesting benchmark of this was a couple of years ago, The Economist magazine, they do these debates on The Economist magazine online. And one of them was, what was the most significant innovation for the human condition in the 20th century? And there were 2 candidates. And it was the computer or the artificial fertilizer. Okay, computer won 3-1. Now, the significance of, now maybe that's not surprising, but the significance of having the artificial fertilizer as the alternative was the idea that this was probably the invention that enabled the largest number of people to be alive and to flourish in some sort of decent fashion. In a sense, if you wanted to think about what was the invention that actually enabled the population to skyrocket and be in some sense sustainable in the way it has become in the 20th century, it became in the 20th century, you would point to artificial fertilizer, and that was the grounds on which the argument was being made by the proponent, that this was actually the most humanly significant thing. But if you actually look at the comments and the responses of people, it's quite clear that aspect of being a human being, namely that we are embodied creatures, biological creatures that have to survive relatively healthy lives for a certain period of time, that didn't seem to be salient in terms of defining people's humanity. It was rather the communicative powers, right? The information powers. Right? It was those things, the kind of Kurzweilian virtues, you might call it, right? Those were the things that people really related to as being the most significant in terms of improving the human condition. Okay? And so I do think, that if you have a debate like that and that turns out to be the answer, that does tell you something about where people's value orientations are, despite, what we might think otherwise. So I do think that there's a sense in which no matter how crazy one may regard this idea that we're going to turn into cyber creatures and so forth, nevertheless the value orientations are changing that way. I mean, there's another interesting benchmark that came up, and it's a bit related to something that Francis said in the beginning about the use of mobile phones in third world countries, right, as a way of contacting people about healthcare issues and so forth. Now, the mobile phone penetration in India and some other third world countries is actually higher than in the United States. Okay, but what are these people using these phones for? I mean, it's certainly not. It's not like it's helping to securitize clean water and food, because those countries still have. There is still all this massive disparity, that exists in terms of the kinds of things that we normally consider necessary to maintain, something more than an impoverished existence, right? If we think about human needs and we think about being able to take care of the material conditions of life as those are normally defined, like in UN standards terms, right? That's not necessarily being alleviated by having a lot of mobile phones. Okay, that's a very interesting point. Yet the people have the mobile phones. Now you might want to blame this on some horrific capitalist conspiracy or something, duping people. But it may also be that the way in which, that the kind of classic way we think about human needs, Abraham Maslow, right, the psychologist of self-actualization, right, from the 1960s and so forth, where there's this hierarchy of needs, right, and in a sense what you have to, at the bottom you have to get, you have to take care of the biological basic human needs, right, that's the bottom, and then you gradually scale your way up into a certain kind of self-actualization, where you start thinking Kurzweilian thoughts, but that only comes at the end, right, there's all this other stuff that has to be taken care of first. But the people in the third world who have these mobile phones aren't thinking that way. They're leapfrogging. Right, in a sense, they don't have that kind of hierarchy of needs that, in a sense, we have so strongly presupposed, and in a way, I think, very much colors and anchors the way in which we, place value on what it is to be human. Because we say, okay, you start by securing the biological human, And then you think about how you can think yourself outside of your body in various ways. And you sort of imagine that that's kind of the way it goes. But in fact, this is not necessarily how people are operating. I do think that the mass introduction of computer-based technologies has really caused people, wittingly or unwittingly, to redefine where their humanity lies. And their humanity may well lie in the ability to communicate and to receive information and so forth, even if it's not doing anything for their life expectancy. Okay? And that's a very interesting point, it seems to me. And so it does raise, I think, a really genuine question about, where do you, place the marker of humanity? Now, in this kind of scenario that I'm talking about, where on the one hand you've got somebody like Peter Singer that says, we have to recapture our animal roots, and then we have Kurzweil saying we have to blast off into cyberspace, right? In the middle, and this is where I believe the middle position will be in the future on this, and this is going to be on the people who we would in the past have called eugenicists. That is to say, people who want to work with the biological human body. In other words, they don't have a kind of Kurzweilian dream, but what they want to do is they want to fine-tune it, right? They want a better version of the biological body. They kind of want to tweak evolution, and move it in a certain direction so it's not just this kind of non-teleological form of evolution that Darwinian natural selection gives you, but rather channel it in a certain way. So work with the basic genome, okay, and then switch various genes on and off, but as it were, play within that game. As it were, take the gene, in other words, accept the biological essentialism to a certain extent, but then see how far you can push that. And so when you get people like Aubrey de Grey, saying if you just switch a few genes on and off, you can live for 1,000 years. Right? And what kind of a life would you have? You would have kind of the life you have now, but for 1,000 years. It's not like you would have a cyber life. You would have the biological human life. And then and of course there are less extravagant versions of that kind of ideal. But that's an ideal that I would say is halfway between those two, because in a sense it still stays within the biological human body. In a way it still takes, as it were, the Darwinian ancestry seriously as anchoring what it is to be a human being, but it says that part of what makes us human is our ability to decide which direction we go within that biological inheritance. But we don't dump the biological inheritance the way Kurzweil wants to do. Okay? And my view is that, even though eugenics was considered this kind of radical, over-the-top position in the 20th century, my guess is this is going to be the moderate position in the 21st century. This is going to be the middle-of-the-road position. Okay? And that the radical sides will be the Peter Singer people, who basically want natural people, who can, and then the Kurzweil people on the other side. And, Alan and John both were talking, the money that flows in the directions of these various things. Well, yes, and there's money to be attracted for all of these options, right? So one of the interesting questions that I think we're going to be facing from the standpoint of the normative constitution of society in the 21st century is how are you going to allow all of these ideals to coexist, right? Because people will want to be pursuing them simultaneously. There will probably be enough money and large enough constituencies to do so in principle, okay? But the kinds of types of human beings and the kinds of values and all those other things that go along with a human existence will be radically different. And so it'll really challenge our conceptions of tolerance and especially what it means to live in a liberal society. And I want to end on that note because the issue of a liberal society is, liberalism as an idea historically becomes a big deal with John Locke and so forth in the 17th century and influences a lot of modern political theory. It really presupposes the great enemy of liberalism was always things like the church and the king who held back people from realizing their potential, and of course people have the potential to govern their lives and all of this. But that was understood within the context that people have a kind of common origin, whether that origin is defined as God or in some sort of biological sense, but nevertheless that human beings at a fundamental level weren't just equally entitled, but in a sense materially equally similar. Right? So very much concomitant with the rise of modern liberalism was this kind of Adam Smith notion of capitalism, of division of labor, that nobody can do everything themselves. Everybody, as it were, is equally talented and equally limited. And so there was a need for everyone else, and there's enough of a kind of common value system that if you just allow people to get on with their lives, they're already sufficiently similar that they'll be able to organize themselves in some kind of rational fashion through democracy. But that presupposes very fundamental, that ultimately there's a kind of a lot of similarity between people. Okay, and that the differences in a way don't matter from the standpoint of being able to run an effective society. That's always been liberalism's assumption. Okay, but now we're talking about a future where we're going to allow the possibility for people to move off in lots of different directions, as it were, taking the concept of humanity in all kinds of directions that may involve radically alternative embodiments, which means different environments in which those embodiments can flourish, which nevertheless will have to interact with each other in certain respects, especially in the political and economic arena. And so how is that going to be governed if we actually allow that kind of pluralism to obtain? Okay, because my guess is that that's going to be sort of the world we're moving ourselves into if we pursue all these ideals in the way they're being pursued at the moment. And so there's a very, very interesting challenge about the normative constitution of society in this century that we're just beginning to get a sense of at the moment, but I think will become more salient as the years go by. And so I'll stop here and... Yeah?
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing? Okay, well, so let's have a little discussion.